Hello and welcome. This is the third lecture in the 25th Annual Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. I'm Lori Young. Most of you know me by now. I'm the director of the Wilderness Institute in the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana. So this is the third lecture as part of the lecture series, Connecting Landscapes Conservation Across Boundaries. We've heard from Raphael Chacon, art historian, who talked about cultural perceptions of wilderness and nature. We've heard from Catherine Pringle last week, who talked about watersheds and the hydroscape and how hydrological factors need to be, we need to be thinking about hydrological factors when we draw park boundaries, when we think about conservation across the landscape. A lot of you had great questions last week. Some of those questions were more along the lines of politics or how we bring together people in particular places to get things done on the ground. Some of the questions Catherine didn't feel like she was in a position to answer, but I want to encourage you to keep those questions in the forefront, to keep thinking about those, and we will get to them as the series progresses. We will have some panels and some speakers that talk specifically about different strategies and tools to implement particular conservation ideas, to implement particular scientific principles. Christine's going to talk a little bit tonight about intersections of science and management, and we will talk about that throughout the series, and so don't be discouraged if something comes up for you in a particular lecture. We'll try to address it throughout the semester. So with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Christine Stonewall, who's here from California tonight. To introduce Christine, Peter Landris is joining us from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. Peter is a landscape ecologist there at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And I had asked Peter to introduce Christine partly because he knows Christine and recommended her for this series, but also because Peter himself has done quite a bit of work on conservation across boundaries. In 1998, he published a book, Stewardship Across Boundaries, with Richard Knight. Highly recommended reading for all of you. And I'd like to welcome Peter and welcome Christine.
And then I will introduce someone else who will introduce someone else, and then we will have this cascading of boundaries among different people who will, in a succession of introductions. No, God, no. Christine got a PhD in 1977 from the University of Maryland. She did her work at the National Zoo with a very eminent evolutionary ecologist at the time. After that, she went and worked for the National Park Service as a scientist, and there's kind of a sordid history of scientists working for the National Park Service. There was this long history of very contorted things where those scientists were pulled out of the Park Service and they worked for an organization called the National Biological Survey, I think was the first one.
By reducing the federal budget, we eliminated the science staff within Interior, hid them in the Biological Survey. We eliminated the agency to show we were really doing good things, and then snuck them into USGS.
Great example of,
So in the end, we still spend.
So Christine Surley ended her formal science career with the U.S. Geological Survey, and she was also an adjunct faculty at UC Davis. And now she's in the enviable position of being a private consultant, which allows her extreme flexibility to do lots of different things and pursue multiple avenues of science. And I think you'll see that in her talk.
That's okay.
Christine, is one of the broadest and widest thinkers that you'll probably ever have a chance to experience. What she's going to talk about is her forays into a whole wealth of different fields that range from management, archaeology, diplomacy, conflict mediation, I have a long list here, historical studies, hydrology, to try to understand what are the implications of these lines that we've drawn on the land. Because these lines that we have drawn on the land have an impact not only on species and management, but they also have an impact on our minds and our psyches. And so Christine has to pull together this incredibly wide variety of information to try to understand what these boundaries, these artificial drawn boundaries, what they're doing to ourselves and our land. And with that, I was going to also say that there's this wonderful book that Christine, she's kind of rolling her eyes, that she was the lead editor on in 20 years ago, in 1903.
2 centuries ago.
This was clearly the leading book on, and the title is Genetics and Conservation, and it's just been republished this year, which I think is a huge, huge kudos to Christine and the work that she's done. So, without me continuing to babble on or having anyone else introduce Christine.
That was sweet. Well, now I'm intimidated. I want to thank you for such a warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. My contact with Montana has been here once before with a graduate student and his committee, and then a little bit further out at Montana State, dealing with some of the common issues in park and forest conservation and management. The subject of boundaries, in a way, came to me when I was in high school. I wasn't aware of where it would take me. It was a little bit like being on Ulysses' voyage, and I'm not entirely sure whether I will make it home, but it's been an adventure in every possible way. It was when Redwoods National Park had been proposed, and I was running around with petitions, trying to get people in the neighborhood where I lived, which was in the city of San Francisco, get them to sign in support of legislation that would establish the park. I was confident and obtained very few signatures, unfortunately. So I went and volunteered some time inside the office of an organization which is widely criticized. Even I criticized them, but at that time they were really holy, and that was the Sierra Club. And there in the office I collected newspaper articles and information that would help them understand how that proposal was doing in Congress. And when I read the proposal, even at the age of 17 or so, I was shocked. I may have been 18. I was shocked by the fact that the proposal didn't take into consideration the fact that establishing the park would displace the population of people that lived there, that lived in the region. This was a community that was supported by logging. I didn't have much sympathy for the companies, but I knew that the people who worked for those companies were not prepared to go work on computers. They weren't necessarily ready to immediately transform into park superintendents or scientists or resource managers. And I asked, why aren't provisions put in this for the people that are there? Because if that's not taken care of, that park's going to have problems. And I didn't think about that much again until I'd say about 1983. And I graduated from high school in 68. It was quite a while later. And what I started noticing was the budget for restoring Redwoods National Park, for dealing with the soil erosion and all the damage that had been made due to the fact that the logging companies were going out of business. But I can guarantee you, if I was there, as I told my own students prior, if I had my daughter starving, unfortunately, to many people's point of view, I would kill that last species to feed her. I am protective of my family, I care, and I don't always use my rational side to guide me. And I suspect that a lot of those people that were working there were in desperate situations. And already their work was unforgiving, but the situation did not even take that into account. Had it done that, that might not have made the solution simple. It might not have created a stable economy or job source for these people. But we could at least have said that we took that into serious consideration. So to the best of my memory, that was not done. But in the course of working with the National Park Service, I developed different sources of different types of perception. One of them was, as a scientist, I had the attributes, the information base that came from all the sciences I could tap into, and put that to use in national parks. What I found out was that the information that I could bring was only a morsel of what was important in making decisions. That things like budget pressure from local legislators, state and the federal, Congress, the form of decision making, whether it's a linear hierarchy or some other arrangement, much more lateral, peripheral control over decision making, all these other things were controlling how quite a bit of management was taking place. And science didn't have a method for being incorporated. Also, we didn't understand a lot of the questions that were being asked of the scientists, and the managers didn't understand a lot of the questions going or coming from the scientists, and I discussed that earlier today. It has to do mostly with linguistics and not intelligence. Anyway, in working on this, I also became aware of another thing, that if we establish legislation to protect our parks, then theoretically they should be protected. But most of what I heard about, and if you look at the resources management reports for most parks, I would throw in forests, wildlife refuges. I'd even go over and start talking about historical and cultural sites, that if you look at those plans, you'll see quite a few, if not most of the problems, sometimes all of them, have to do with things that don't even take place inside, other than the effects. So boundaries became important to me. When I started seeing species area models in ecology, I had problems with that. I saw that when we look at species number in a particular area, that we're counting on something static being stable and countable and indicative of the health of a process, not just the structural properties of an ecosystem. I'm cutting that short because that's a whole other the subject in itself, but what I increasingly became aware of is that our concept of what protected areas could do had some problems with reality. So, for example, if we decide that a particular area can house, let's say, 200 mountain lions, to be able to say that, I imagine, would be important, but it would have to be based somewhat on what they eat. And one would have to look at the pyramid effect, the trophic pyramid as people call it, and notice that the space that would be occupied by their food source might actually go outside of that area. And that the process of change, particularly in habitats like we have in the northern temperate zone, the properties of the habitat shift with time. And so this mobility, all these things are not new to you, but they are the things that caused me to think increasingly about the importance of boundaries. Coming from, sorry. Okay. That's okay. The other thing, I was coming from another direction. This had to do with communication. I saw that while I was working in Washington, we had the legislators, we had the central offices like Park Service, Forest Service, the director's office, we had the scientific branches, we had managerial branches. All these groups had things that were important to them regarding the structure and functioning of public land. The information that was being collected scientifically had to do with dynamics that were often summarized statistically and presented in formats with data. When we talked about the politics of it, we were talking in qualitative terms, including things such as opinion. And when we try to integrate this information and plan into the future, it's very hard to write an equation where we can balance both sides and feel that we've got some sort of precise outcome. And I looked in my mind for what would provide a bridge, and I started focusing on boundaries at that point. I felt that if we really are concerned about protecting land, and we do have to designate it, then we should start focusing not as much in isolation on what happens within it, but really the only reason we're doing this hasn't to do so much with the within as from what's happening throughout. Does that make sense? And so it's that relationship between in and out that I think should be the foundation of a lot of the work in conservation. Needless to say, I'm happy to be here because you have a program that does orient itself, crossing professions, crossing disciplines, and crossing concepts involving boundaries. And that is really ahead. So now to boundaries. One of the things that I see is common in ecology is our efforts, and landscape ecology, our efforts to classify ecotones, what we call edges, ecotones, barriers, borders, corridors, and to provide ways of defining them and measuring their size and their influences. And that's extremely valuable within ecology. We talk about boundaries in ecology in many different ways. We sometimes refer to them as lines on a map. Sometimes we refer to them as the border of some sort of ecotone or transition. And sometimes we refer to them as limits in thinking. We use the term with a great deal of flexibility. And this is true of most professions. The term boundary, I've seen it used, and you have seen additional, in hydrology, in archaeology, architecture, law, in Native American affairs. We've seen it in religion. We've seen it in, obviously, politics, including warfare. Middle East is a good example of some of the boundary problems that exist. It's a term that's used in quite a few different places, and interestingly, there seems to be, in some areas, more variability within profession or within discipline on how the term is used than I find between them. There is a term and a meaning that doesn't seem to be enclosed within basically a bottle. It's a meaning that transcends the barriers of profession, culture, and discipline. And what I've been interested in is finding where there is, or whether there is, an underlying continuity that can be used so that when we talk about boundaries, whether it be scientifically or politically, that we can take the science and apply it to politics, or the politics and influence the science in a positive way, but at least have the word mean the same thing and have the same implications. The term boundary is used in psychology. I think I've seen it used in autism to explain what I interpreted to be a real difficulty in perceiving the limits, not only on personal space, but on tangible space. I see similar things in the work we do, but one of the things that I found most interesting is the geometric line, and this is what I focused on. And that has caused me to think very differently about how to go about environmental impact analysis, how to go about design, and how to go about planning. The conclusion, tentatively, that I have, certainly it could be said in detailed terms, but a summary of it is that when we write in fields of conservation and other applications, we meaning ecologists, field biologists, wildlife biologists, we talk about the subject matter, and then at the end we say there are sociological and cultural implications in this work, and these have to be taken into consideration. And that's right, they do have to be taken into consideration. It's brought in as an add-on and it tags along like a wagon. What I would say is it's the driving variable that is the boundary and occupies a space which is not geometric in itself. It is not, the boundary itself is not just simply a photonegative, a line that exists in space, so that if you see habitat and you see this invisible line, if you took a photonegative of it, you don't see a line in invisible space. There's a whole new aura, a whole new occupation there, and it's mental, and it has to do with culture, and it has to do with insecurity or doubt. And this is the character of boundaries. And the first thing that reacts to something conceptual is not going to be a tree that's going to react to a pollutant, and it's not going to be an animal that runs away. The first reaction is a psychological or mental reaction. Now, whether that's an insect reacting mentally or a baboon or a human, and I don't say that in a bad way, I would feel very confident to say to you that if you establish the boundary, the very first gradient, the very first reaction, the primary generated effect is mental. And from that, with people or any kind of animal behavior, if there's a stimulus and is perceived, there's often a reaction, which makes that secondary element, since we're talking about the boundary, one rule being put down, people reacting to it, then the first real interaction is also fundamentally social. And it's that then stimulates the kinds of behavior that alter habitat, that alter culture, that alter all aspects of politics, attitudes, economics, and law. I'm not saying that sociology and cultural disciplines, I'm using sociology, by the way, as a short for just about everything that has to do with psychology and culture. I'm not saying that sociology is the only important thing or that it's more important. What I'm simply saying is that it has to be recognized that the establishment of a boundary is a non-tangible process in terms of touching. It involves conception, it involves imagination, and these occupy a space which is not tangible in terms of what we have as recognizable 1, 2, and 3 dimension. And I think that even if you look at the first effect, which is also one of reaction, one has to understand why these subjects are overlooked most of the time, because we know boundaries. Even in geography, there's been considerable amount written about boundaries. But what a boundary is and what the continuity is in that thing that we draw really hasn't been looked at that I could find out in depth. And it's not something that can afford to be ignored. I think quite a few of the problems we've had in conservation in implementing what we've set aside, whether it be in wildlife management, forestry, whether it be dealing with cultural areas that we wish to protect, the problem that we've dealt with has to do that we've eliminated the driving variables in the model and gone from there to predict what's needed and what's to come about. Now, that's about as complex as I get, and it is an opinion, but I feel that the knowledge base for this isn't me, and it's not the information only that I collect, but what I've found is that anything that's going to be useful regarding an understanding or definition of boundary requires a continuity across professions, across cultures and languages and disciplines. It requires that, in addition to the continuity, that there be some principle that is ultra simple, that is something that we don't really argue with because of opinion, but that is there because of its utility in communication and its implications. So that's where I would come to the point where what in the world is a boundary? There are many different ways that the term's used, but I'd like to focus on the line, which is the most consistent from geometry to physics to cultural development, international peace, border commissions, wildlife management, name it. And the properties of a line remain consistent throughout this. If you find anything in here revealing, then I'm not doing a good job. All of this really is fundamental, but sometimes I've found scientifically, I hate to say last century, I'm not that old, only 54, but when we look at the fundamentals, we sometimes fail to look at the simple things and to collect information on what we observe before we set about modeling it. Modeling is essential when we have data and when we've conducted research observations to get a fix on the angle from which we'd like to observe the system. The boundary is simple, it's a line. Lines, if one were to look at the physics, whether you look at strings or whether you look at infinitely small lines, they contain an infinite amount of information. there's an infinite amount of data points that can be placed upon a line. The line is essentially, it's the single dimension of length. And if we have two of them, we get the 2 dimensions, and so on and so on. We can build up volume all the way to some super dimensions that are way beyond my qualifications. The point is, when we look at a line, we can say whether it's a park, whether it's a neighborhood property, whether it's a country, that the line there has an infinite amount of information. And that's pretty simple a statement, but that is one concept that seems to be consistent wherever the term is used regarding land, except for sometimes in ecology, where it's used synonymously with a physical thing. And what I found interesting in law is that I found more distinction between the mapped element of line, or the boundary, and the physical elements of it. The boundary is not a physical element. The continuity that I see in its use and in the implications of the word boundary deal with things that are non-physical. When we get to the edge or transition or border, we see physical effects, they're tertiary effects of the establishment of boundaries. They are effects that come after some mental state, some imagination, some decision, some opinion has laid down rules. And the rules and statements associated with that are what defines that boundary. And it's an infinite amount of information. It can be useless, it can be useful, but the fact is that space is occupied by an information which is non-tangible. Yet that is really what powers quite a bit of what goes on regarding boundaries. Now, let me just check where I'm at. One of the things that I'd like to see regarding that is that there be some sort of scientific and lay community, if there was some way that we could have our cultures agree on how the term is used, I think we'd find a lot of improvement in how we can manage areas that are public land, how we could deal with private land conflicts, and how we could deal with international conflicts as well. When we talk about boundaries, first thing I want to get into is the edges. I imagine all of you, or most of you, dealt with national forests or national parks. You understand that there's a conflict frequently between what's established inside and what's to happen outside. And one of the things that we notice is that there are changes that take place due to disagreements or simply different values in what the land should be for. And one of the most common ways that edges are looked at and how buffers are designed are with regard to the actual location of the boundary. So that if we have some sort of outline, which is the map of a particular park that delineates where the park is, that the buffer and the effects that are examined are with regard to the geometric space, that location, the coordinates where the boundary is located. And the search for gradients related to the effects of that boundary are also searched for within that immediate area. And what I have found in looking over literature and working with parks and other areas, what I found is that there is no reason to expect that the generated edges would necessarily be congruous, and right in the region of the park. They can be very distant. The areas that are considered prime habitat, as many of you already know, can be exterior or cross outside. And there are matters of movement and motion, movement that are affected by the attitudes that go along this boundary, which is in fact a segmented property. Boundaries are segmented every time you have a vegetation type, or if you want to look at the distribution of land uses adjacent to a park or reserve. If you want to look at the differences in home ranges, locations of home ranges of different organisms, or if you want to look at the uses of visitor trails, whatever it is you happen to be interested in, when you move along a particular boundary, you find that the characteristics associated with it that have been derived from what was set down and the interaction of the inside folks and the outside folks, that each one of those have different potential impacts on how the area thrives, how it reacts to management and external land use. What I found throughout most of my work was that when we set up studies, we orient them frequently with respect only to the location of the boundary. And what I'm saying is something that all of you probably understand, and that is that the boundary that is generated by the establishment of protection, or that was actually the motivator for setting it aside, is not necessarily overlaying the property outline. And I think that's really significant, because when we make our studies, when we establish whether or not we need additional space for particular species, we have to take into account that the functioning of the boundary may not share the same geometry. How am I doing time-wise? Oh, okay. I'd like to you have to forgive me, I'm just going to take a second. One of the things that I found is in the national parks, if we take something like Yellowstone and we look at the roads that go through the park and we look at the structure of populations within it, it used to be that we would look at, let's say, elk populations within the park, estimate population densities, and we'd look at what was necessary to maintain those elk populations, also take into account the fact that part of the park was down in Jackson Hole. Now, if we really wanted to look at that park, the way I talked about it with my students when I was teaching is I would take it like a slice out of an orange, and I would look at the slice and call that the park. And then I would take one side of it, like I was going to make a cocktail or something, open it up, and I'd see all these wedges standing. And these are subunit boundaries, essentially. They act each with their own personality. They have their own implications. They have their own regulations and their own effects, which then interact with the overall system. So that when we look at a boundary, if there are points that disconnect this continuous edge, well, not edge, but this continuous line, what we find is that we obtain subsets of boundaries, and their attributes interact, their edge effects interact, and have different implications for the success of the program or the outcome. And one of the things regarding population sizes and behaviors is that when we get into metapopulations and look at behavior of different fragments of populations, when we look at a large forest or we look at a large park, we need to take into consideration that the boundary potentially has effects on segments of it and its associated volume that aren't necessarily in harmony with one another. They may be following slightly different paces, slightly different trends, and success. And again, I'm hoping that none of this is new. I know it isn't, but it should be bringing together information. One of the papers I read, actually it was a book by a man named Hurd, was published in 1906, and it was on real estate. And this man took the history of real estate going back to the year 42, I think it was BC, or 52 BC, he's very precise, looking at the history of Paris. Now, having been born there, I was curious and started reading the book. Ken Watt, a colleague of mine, had pointed it out. And it's a fascinating book because in the first 30, 40 pages, he talks about 2,000 years history of how people deal with property and boundaries. And one of the things that I found fascinating about it is how a boundary can affect behavior. And this reinforced my thinking about how important it is for us to get a grip on how to incorporate the culturally related disciplines into what we would consider fundamentally an ecological issue. And one of the things that I came up with, or I was talking about with the superintendent out west, is in the National Park Service, we have a predisposition these days to want to move out public areas into the periphery or outside the park. And we want to add additional area to a particular park. And one of the things that came to me was that when we wish to add area, it's how we manipulate the boundaries that can affect what sort of space we actually have either control over or influence over. And it seemed to me that sometimes, and this is not a blanket rule, but sometimes when we wish to buy a block of land and add it, it appears that we're adding a homogeneity to some internal area or species range, and that we're improving the qualities that it has and potentially its survival, right? And what I was looking at is that in looking at herd and how streets without stop signs reduce traffic, they reduce commercial development, that there can be so many stops in a distance for a business to work based on the transportation system. So in the old days when they were moving along in their carriages or later on in the train, every other stop would go out of business if they were too close to the next business. There are rules. And one of the things that came to me regarding parks was what would happen if we bought about a 50-foot road right-of-way, where you buy essentially a strip of land that's not very thick. But what it does is it completely blocks access to anything on the side of the road. Now, this would not be liked by a lot of people, but I'm talking about this whether it be for parks, whether it be for anything else. If you do that, what do you come up with? You can essentially manipulate the landscape, and you find that your boundaries, which appear to be very pathological from an ecological standpoint, have social implications that can really enhance the quality of the ecological outproduct. And that I found fascinating. And I think that in terms of moving in parks or in reserves, the distance people have to go for gas, that if the resources are available at a point where it makes it uneconomical to develop a gas station, a town, or whatever else at a particular exit, what you can do is increase, if you're looking for habitat where species can migrate and so on, you're increasing that amount of space. There are things that if we look at how we manage boundaries and their implications on the psychological reactions of people, I think we can learn quite a bit. So in taking it in short, I think that we need to come together with a definition and a function that has to do with boundaries. And as superficial as it sounds, I think that in disciplines we need to understand that when we're looking at a boundary, we are not looking at a line, but we're looking at a non-tangible fog, or fog implies things, let's say a cloud or some sort of multidimensional thing that occupies space just like a landscape and ecological system do. And this whole space is contained within a line that we call the boundary. And that space, the legislation, and the psychological and cultural conditions that went into defining the legislation that sets the boundary is essentially what constitutes this mass, this psychological equivalent of ecosystem or landscape. And in defining that and studying it, I think then we can begin to look at what the effects are ecologically. And at this point, I can go into more detail on certain points, or I can stop and let some of you ask me questions, because in a way, I either stay at this level or I get off in one of my tangents and it goes on forever. I'm humble. So, ask me if you have a question. Tell me what, yeah.
Christy, will you give a couple of specific examples of, I mean, it was fascinating what you said about drawing a line 50 feet on either side of a road, and how that would have ecological impacts outside of that. Can you tell us how?
Okay, I'll tell you how, but I will not tell you specifics because that's not my field. What I'm doing, I hope, is talking to people in specific fields. It's their expertise that defines how one sets up the structure. I wouldn't pretend to be qualified at that, but I'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. If we take a park like, take a simple one like, well, Yosemite maybe, and we wanted to increase the amount of habitat space in that region, so it's not just restrained as much to the valley area, and we wanted to create land. Let's say, I shouldn't just use Yosemite, but let's say we had forest space or rangeland next to it, but there was a strong development of people, let's say, moving in from the cities for summer homes, or there was a strong recreational industry that was growing, or there was something that happened to be considered a problem that was developing at the borders of the park. And what I'm saying is that most businesses depend on being visible from the road. They have to be visible from the road. They have to be accessible from the road. Places where business and urban development grows, where there are stop signs, fundamentally. With Lassen National Park, one of the things I talked about with the superintendent there is I said that the suburban area in was it Reading, is moving a little bit too much to the east. And I said, what about, what kind of influence do you have for them putting more utility buildings on the side where there's, on the far end of the side, and try to get influence commerce so that more of the real estate development occurs on the far side of the freeway? What can be done to enhance that? Because the trajectory will be then in the opposite direction, and the freeway itself will be one obstacle. If you establish land that is outside the park, has no stops, has no intersections, the chances that that land will be high density populated or used economically, for income, whether it be industry or for, if you're against ranching, if you're against forestry. The point is that as you set that aside, the access to the land decreases. I'm not promoting anti-forestry or anti-agriculture. In some cases, I flip to the other side and I have problems with how we operate in conservation. I have, in the course of working with the parks, I've been very much concerned with how they develop their relationships to the outside, as most of you have. And what I've been trying to say and promote in some of the conversations I've had is, how in the world do you relax the easement, the contrast between inside and outside? The most ultimately good boundary would be one where on the inside you have a hope, on establishing it outside you have a similar hope. It happens that both of you agree pretty much on how the land's going to be used and what you want out of it. And as a result, you don't need to invest energy with don't trespass signs. You don't need to patrol it. And you don't need to have fines. You don't need to have helicopters. And you don't need to have legislators. That is a very energy efficient system where you don't have to do much to manage it. And one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating is, how in the world does one accomplish that? And sometimes that means giving, not just taking. And there are areas where making land accessible can actually enhance the size of the area that's functional. And of all places in India, when I was down in some of the forested areas in more of the southern end of the country, I talked with several field managers there that were running some forest reserves, and they provided water, clean water, to the local people who were rather poor. And what they did, I'm not saying that our national parks or forests should do this, but what they did with very little staff, money, means, or legislators, what they were able to do was say, okay, we realize you people are hungry and starving, we'll give you fresh water, make that available to you, clean water, and we'll let you prune out trees in this particular area in exchange for planting. So I think it was teak, if I'm not mistaken. And what they did was they immediately had the people log out some of what they needed to survive, and then they had them plant. And they set up plantations which overlapped the actual boundary somewhat, but with time expanded what we would call not absolute protection, but some restraints on land development and land uses outside. A sort of symbiosis arose, which increased the available area for species that were actually mobile. What it also did was reduce the external pressure that came from poaching. And there are ways in different societies to deal with conflicts that cross boundaries in terms of agreeing on what can give and what can be flexible versus what you can't give or be flexible about. I think if we look in systems that are in North America, there's a lot of popularity right now when we look at regional conservation, where there's taking something beyond Glacier and Waterton and looking at entire major sections of corners of the continent and thinking about the conservation of those ecosystems. One of the things that we need to think about there is how in the world do we make that available to the people who need it, not only successful in conservation, how do we set up parks that can maintain a balance? We have a tendency on the one hand there to think on broad scale terms, and while we're beginning to take in culture, what we're not doing is a great deal of boundary analysis regarding the jurisdictional boundaries and the cultural boundaries that pre-exist in these spots. And that's something that I think we need to increase. We don't take into account in conventional park and reserve design right now the phenotypes in North America for a lot of species. Namely that when we look at species diversity and try to contain them, we don't anticipate that the diversity itself is dependent on that mobility, that the phenotype requires different habitats, it requires the kind of mobility that our present concept of boundaries doesn't permit. Let me stop with that so I can ramble. Yeah.
I really think you made a really important point that the notion of a boundary is not a tangible entity. And you went on to talk about it as having sort of kind of a fuzziness to it. And I'd just like to suggest that I think an analogy with the concept of property is really appropriate here to kind of ground this a little further. And that is that most of the folks and students I interact with think of property as like this hat. It's a tangible, material, concrete thing. And what I try and really emphasize, and I think that's what you're getting at with the non-tangible part, it's not that this hat is, the boundary is tangible. It's the social relations around it that says, hey, you get your hands off of this. And I think what really we're talking about is the notion of property and the social relations that are defined around who has access to and control and under what conditions people can interact with what's inside. And the reason I bring it up is because I don't think the notion that it's kind of fuzzy or cloudy is as appropriate as thinking of it as actually a series of social relations and social institutions that in some places have been very formally organized over time, and that maybe the folks creating the formal parks aren't recognizing some of the customary social institutions around this notions of how property perhaps in the past has been in a sense very highly regulated. So I just wanted to add as a comment that I think it's fantastic, this notion that we recognize that the notion of boundaries isn't the tangible thing as much as it is basically a series of social relations.
Well, the point is actually that, but I'd like to go one step further. And the very bottom line of that point is, by definition, that those social relations, the laws that are set down that actually define that boundary, reflect a value assessment and essentially put in action those sets of values that is the boundary. That is what shapes it, what you were talking about. That notion of property or that notion of preference is what sets that boundary down. It is the boundary's definition. That what I called fuzzy and cloudy was actually directed at what I envision myself and my colleagues in ecology to think about, and that is that you've got to count, what's in the soil. You've got to look at the soil. You've got to look at the GIS. You've got to look at the distribution of mammals. You've got to look at the forestation. And what I'm saying is that there's a whole world there that is included in what that line is. It's a whole other space. What's difficult to do is to conceptualize it, but that's what science can do. From a utilitarian standpoint, it's very simple and very direct and seems very blah. But the beauty of it is that that line, which has non-tangible properties, is the major cause of change and action that we all, I think, would agree that it is a major impetus for change. That line is something that is understood by people who have nothing to do with science, but understand what the value system and the line reflect. From the standpoint of wildlife management, from the standpoint of forestry, land management, even in terms of international politics, we have a tendency to look at the physical features of the land and assess the outcomes that are there that are physical. We may assess the outcomes that are there in terms of international relationships. What I haven't seen yet is a real definition of those cultural properties, those senses of property which define the line. It's been given an attribute or listed as an attribute of the protection, of the legislation. But the notion that a line has properties that are not within a touching geographic space, they basically have to do with the mind. See, someone coming out of my fields where I've dealt with animals all my life and plants, telling me that I have to go out there and measure something I can't touch is very debilitating. I want to see the things run, jump, eat, and do all sorts of things, or grow. But what I'm realizing, or what I've learned to realize, and I find is intuitively obvious to most healthy people on this planet, is that a boundary is a construct that's mental. And it is the reason, it's our lack of definition, lack of continuity, the lack of recognition of that within science has been the basis for most disagreements, problems in warfare, problems in management, species extinction, and we can move on. And it's not because the sciences aren't doing well. It's because, again, we are using a term and assuming properties about it that are not shared by others. When I talk about boundary in any, I talk about the boundary in my property. Is it the hedgerow or is it the fence? See, what's there that we interpret to be the boundary has significant social implications. But neither the hedge nor the fence nor the posts that I put there are boundary. They are third-degree effects from establishing that line for some reason. It was the original subdivision of, in our case, it was agricultural land. And then from there, my attitudes about what I want with my land and my neighbors' attitudes, what they want with their land. And then somebody puts up a fence or a hedgerow, and that is a third, physical property that develops. I guess the one message I would like to get across is that we need to look at boundaries and understand the continuity that already exists that has to do with these non-tangible properties of lines that essentially take the social views and culture and plant them on coordinates. The definition of the line is what is contained within it. What's contained within it has an infinite amount of information. It's just not tangible and visible to us. And I think that's so important that I keep saying the same thing and same thing over again, no matter how simple it is. It seems that all of us who have been working in fields having to do with either real estate, resources management, agriculture. I've worked with a lot of different people, and I don't have one single way of viewing land use. What I do know is that the consistency in most land use, including legislation and in management, has to do with a notion of boundary that is variable to the point where you can't use it even within a discipline. The meaning of boundary is more diffuse within ecology than it is between law and the architectural design group at Harvard. It's remarkable that these things, these terms, especially this one, is so important internationally. You see it in TV and commercials, and you see it as a result of what's happening in the Middle East. We see problems in South Africa with newly established boundaries and people being deprived of visas to transport to see their families or to obtain water. All over the world, we see things happening regarding boundaries, and yet what we failed to do, and I mean, I don't find a profession or discipline that really focuses in on the single definition and agrees with other professions and other disciplines that this particular attribute does show consistency among uses, and it also has some basic geometric and physical properties that are usable in any application. And you know, I can't get more complicated than that other than in details. I hope that hasn't been disappointing. Of course, you have to say no. But if the subject of boundaries is of interest to you, one thing you might do is look at the history of, take just particular boundary of one site that interests you, whether it's a real estate location in town, whether it be city boundaries, whether it be state boundaries, or park, and look at the kinds of factors that went into defining that and what the cultural and physical implications were of setting aside that particular site. And get an idea of how much information is contained in that line. And just having done that, I think you'll get a perspective that is different from your having looked at that line or that map and set out to determine what was the purpose of setting that land aside for a given purpose. And what was the reason? I think you'll find that your outcome is a little bit different than it would have been before. And in terms of disciplines, I'm starved for an idea and action from people in different professions and disciplines. By professions, I include working on your land. There's a great deal of information stored in people who are involved in resources management, who work with cattle. I learned a lot about animal behavior, and when I was dealing with ungulates from Africa, sable antelope, I learned most of what I needed to learn about how to deal with the animals from a guy who was a former cattle rancher. And he taught me tidbits about how to interpret what the animals were doing and how to stay out of trouble. And the thing is that we need to understand how this term is being used or how it can be used. It's a little bit like using the word species or using the word real estate or using the word property. I think all those things are fairly well defined in our culture and across cultures. But I don't think the term boundary is, and I think that's fundamental to making any kind of progress. Any other?
Other cultures that you've seen that define boundaries differently? I mean, is it happening
Yes.
throughout the world, or do you have a case that
Well, I've looked at, yeah, there are very different cultural perspectives dealing with boundaries. It's a little bit like animals in situations where there's not much competition for utilization of resources or access, whether it be to a nesting site or water source or food. When there isn't that strong a competition, there's a certain amount of room for motion and a lot less aggression regarding overlapping areas. One thing that you can think of in terms of scent marking in mammals, we always think about it as a territorial thing, where we're marking off our territory. It's just as much, as some people already know, a communication device. that says, here I was, this is the last time I was here, how are you doing? You know, come and let me know you live. There's a very different point of view that can be had about that. And I think in people, when we look at boundaries, there are cultures that are not technological, that haven't gotten into what we call, you know, the Western style of living, who dealt with boundaries a little bit differently, that didn't look at them as lines. The line is a concept, and it had to be drawn. The most mental boundary, of course, is one that is imposed on a surface and doesn't look like the surface. In other words, if you draw a line that goes, it's just simply straight, that's a non-existent thing in what we visualize as nature or as substrate or as landscape. So when we've done that, we've gone to a conceptual stage where we actually use drawing and representation. So the point where culture gets to that level, yeah, it's pretty much that way, as I've described. When people are not constrained and don't need the communication and the documentation that's on a physical surface, it's not quite as serious in terms of maintaining a very, very closely mapped boundary. It doesn't mean that there's no competition at all for space or maintaining of distances, though. But there are different ways of looking at it. And just like there are in plants and animals, many different ways of looking at boundaries. Secretion of toxins from plant roots, or maintaining certain body smells to keep other individuals farther away or attract individuals, all the way through to the marking out of home ranges or marking of distinct territories. So, you know, there are different ways. And that has to be taken into consideration. What we're doing now in some third world countries is, I mean, if you looked at Eastern Africa 20 years ago, it was one thing. If you go there now, there's been one method of boundary setting that's been imposed on another, and the systems have changed. And this is one of the components in looking at boundaries that's very important, is to understand, number one, that boundaries don't change, they come and they go. When there has been a change made, a whole new system's been, not a system, but a whole new boundary's been defined, and the system itself has taken on a whole other dimension in terms of time, so that you have first boundary, second boundary, et cetera, et cetera. And with each one has the edge effects and the properties which continue over time. Those effects don't necessarily stop the day the boundary does, but at subsequent changes, new boundaries being established, these elements of change merge, some of them get extinguished. These are all properties that are measurable and definable. History gives us a lot of information on how people have dealt with boundaries, material that we can use in trying to define how these things function. Okay, my last statement in all this is, I do not think that I'm talking to an audience that really needs to be told what boundaries are. But I can be very confident to say that the way they're used implies that there is no definition. So, and from the standpoint of a scientist, I'm saying that number one, if this isn't done, what does this mean to all the modeling that depends on our measuring in, around, along, or defining on the basis of boundaries that we have? These are drawn boundaries, okay? The next thing I say is, one of the greatest problems we have in management and conservation is, how come the people don't get along with the agencies? How come the agency managers don't get along with the scientists? How come ecologists don't talk to systematists? How come sociologists come at the end of the sentence as an add-on? Right? And we took into consideration the fact that people were this and people were that, and we know now that for designing that reserve, we need to incorporate these thoughts. The fact is that the information crossover between the professions and disciplines needs a platform, it needs a table on which to talk. I think the boundary is a table, because that boundary has within it non-tangible parameters that allow the qualified, statistically qualified as opposed to quantified information to marry with the quantified information, not in terms of quality and non-quality, but in terms of kind and the types of surfaces, boundary surfaces or boundary volumes that one can be accounting for. In tangible space, ecosystems, and in the landscape, the boundary has no volume. When we look at the boundary and its properties psychologically and culturally, it has infinite volume. And the way in which we perceive these two types of space really brings about the fundamental which allows for the crossover of communication, not only between disciplines, but between professions and between lifestyles. A simple little word, well-defined, understood, would make an entire difference, I think, all the way from two neighbors getting along through two countries getting along. We just don't understand what the word implies. And we don't try to give it a special letter B or slash the O or do whatever is necessary to say this is the technical meaning of the word, not the analogy and not the metaphor. Boundary has a lot of other valuable meanings, but the boundary I'm talking about is a technical term that has absolute importance in any of our work. I don't care if it's mining, I don't care if it's conservation. I do, but I mean that any of those are fine. Now, I hope this hasn't been too dull in terms of talking about a single word or concept, but I do hope that somewhere along the line, some people will get together and try to bring in the professions and the disciplines, not only here, not only in our country, but generally bring together an understanding of what the word means and implies, so that when I read treaties and when I read assignments of authority, or when I read who owns the property, I know that there are certain implications that are understood across the board. And I think in some ways lawyers are a little closer than us to that, and apparently some architectural design folks are a little closer to that than us. I was shocked in a positive way by a simple page I read on the web put out by the Harvard Architectural Design School. I said, they understand this better than ecologists do. And yet I was being sarcastic. I very much respect the field of ecology, but I find that sometimes because we're very purpose-oriented when we apply ecology to wildlife or conservation, when we look at conservation biology, landscape ecology similarly, we have this notion of where we're getting to, that there's a purpose, that there's a design, and we forget some of the fundamentals. We haven't described the landscape, and the real landscape in this case has to do with people and has to do with what they consider to be the line between what they control and about what you control. Yeah.
On that point, hopefully, so all about this drawing of boundaries, and whether it's technical, scientific, or otherwise, it just seems to me, and I wonder what you think, that the geopolitical takes control of these decisions, and these decisions are made primarily on geopolitical considerations and not on other scientific facts. Do you care to comment?
No, well, I do think they're made on geopolitical considerations. If we want to go as far back as we can in history and look at the changes of boundaries, the movement and the effectiveness of boundaries is nothing new to civilization. And it is, bottom line, it's always been social. And if there's been a political realm, in other words, if the social groups are large enough to have politics or to have royalty, whatever it happened to be, those lines were drawn and they were defended to the extent to which the proprietor was paranoid about something being done to it or having upset people on the other side. So it is fundamentally geopolitical. But when we start bringing it into the realm of international negotiations, when we bring it into the realm of my world that I'm more familiar with, which is conservation, wildlife management, looking at also cultural lands management, I'm very much interested in those aspects. It's somehow a little bit different. It's almost as though that simplicity of it, the fact that it's the line that's drawn for administration and authority, isn't really dealt with. It's not really understood because it comes as an afterthought to describing the system and not what defines it. Does that make sense?
No, I
Yeah,
agree with that.
yeah,
Lines are drawn without that background.
yeah,
That's the point.
yeah.
And I'm wondering, how could we apply that to today's issues?
Well,
So we, as practitioners in the field, or students going out there and challenging that question, how could we apply those principles you talked about?
well, there are lots of ways you can apply it. Let's take it in the near territory first. When it comes to wildlife, I would reconsider how to set up transects to monitor environmental change based on what is held within that particular boundary in terms of its definition. And I don't mean the fact that it's a boundary, but the kinds of social attitudes, cultural attitudes, predispositions, and so on locked up in setting it down. And then looking at the primary social implications of it being set down and reacted to, and then looking at what needs to be measured with respect to that, and modify the transects to accommodate it. They either won't change or they will change in location. Similarly, in adding land or trying to move to add land or to increase resources for a particular land use, don't just think about what you're adding on in terms of total surface volume or surface area, or volume if you're into things that go a little higher off the ground. But consider what the surface area ratio is, which a lot of people do already, but even beyond that, what the functional geometry of that boundary implies socially based on what it dictates and how people have traditionally reacted to it. And that's where that thing I said in terms of dealing with road signs, dealing with stops, dealing with corridors, whatever it happens to be, these have old established social reactions on the part of people, and these can be used, and the boundary carries with it a type of behavior that can be to some extent predictable, and that isn't being tapped. And I think in one of my favorite ways, when it comes to work I did with national parks, boundaries bring a justification to the resource managers to deal with some problems that they have facing them every single day. Like, why am I allowing prairie dogs out of Wind Cave? How am I going to deal with the pigs coming into Hawaii volcanoes? What am I going to do about mercury in Bodega Bay? Or, it goes on and on. I think that the fundamental there is that their practical point of view, saying, I've got a problem across my boundaries, I think one of the most real and one of the most correct descriptions of what the boundary is and what it's accomplishing on a very practical level. What science can do is take that another step, and that is develop a more formalized means of providing that manager with a description that's a little bit more usable than intuition. Intuition has worked very well, and sometimes that's what runs quite a bit of good conservation work. The science sometimes is not as helpful as we think it is. But the one thing that we can do as scientists is increase the quality of information, the quality of the briefing that goes to the managers regarding what they know to exist, and help them that way. So it's something that I think is opening a box, I would say a Pandora's box in some ways too, but it's opening a volume of inquiry that has been neglected because the source of the volume has been measured with our eyes. And it doesn't appear to have volume, therefore it has none. And I'm saying that it has volume, behavior, it has lifespan and impacts all of its own. And these, by definition, drive what's going on in conservation. If conservation is to counteract some of the deleterious effects of human land uses, then by definition, it's the human behavior and concept which is what we're worried about. So why jump over that and go straight to the problem solving? We need to have part of that definition and that description obtained.
There's one more question in the back.
Your definition of boundaries, I know that this is a whole different issue than land use. And with the definition of boundaries, you talk about the social conditions surrounding the boundaries, integrating that into the boundary consideration. Now, what do you do when you have several different social conditions, such as those who want to have motorized recreation versus those who don't? And the two are fundamentally in many areas incompatible.
Right.
And the motorized how do you define that boundary and whose social conditions do you take into effect when you secure those boundaries?
The boundary was defined by the attitudes and culture and legislation that set it down. I mean, if it's a country that uses legislation, which I presume you're talking about out here, so that is the boundary. It is that contained social characteristic and definition that came with it. The management decisions and the policies that arose from that are among the secondary, what I would call secondary and tertiary effects, that they're social effects that result from interpretations of that legislation. The incompatible uses, or what some people would call incompatible uses of snowboarding, or what am I snowboarding? You know what I'm talking about. Thank you. And whether it be multiple use forestry or ranching or tourism, when we get into those are, they are what I would consider boundary effects, generated effects, that are sometimes in conflict and sometimes not. But they are effects. They are derivatives of the outcome of interpretation. I tell you, I'm drawing this line, I know why I want it, and let's say you don't happen to agree with me, and I'm going to do whatever I can to tell you that it's there. And as we go back and forth, depending upon how dominant I feel over you and how submissive you appear, maybe I'll stop putting energy into it. If you're really persistent and really, pain, then what I might find is not only do I have to sustain my energy level, but what I find I may have to do at some point is try to relax that gradient. I may have to make some compromises to make sure that while I'm sleeping at night, you're not going to go over and knock down my wall. And it's that sequence of events that leads to the things we think about or talk about that have to do with how do you deal with cattle ranching and maintaining prairie dogs in the same place. How do you put elk in Jackson Hole in the midst of urban development? Or how do you deal with visitors in Yosemite National Park, or pigs, like I said before, in Hawaii volcanoes? So those things are not the boundary itself or the definition of it, but these are secondary, tertiary effects of how people view it and feel they have to defend upon it, or defend it, I shouldn't say upon it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, it was so interesting. I thought it was great.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I reviewed some literature on boundaries for my district.